Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It's Tuesday, May 17th, 2011, and our special guest is Mark Fenske, the author of, or co-author of The Winner's Brain, 8 Strategies that Great Minds Use to Achieve Success. Mark, welcome. So glad to have you here.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here.
The Future of Education is a Web 2.0 Labs project. We also appreciate the support we get from Learn Central and Illuminate, now Blackboard Collaborate. Coming up, we want to make sure that you are aware of EduBloggerCon. This is the all-day unconference. It's free. Be held in Philadelphia just prior to the ISTE conference. This is a really fun and great event. You do not need to be registered for ISTE to come. It is in the Pennsylvania Convention Center. That's June 25th, 8 to 5 p.m. We have a lot of really fun things we're organizing, including what we think we're going to call the Keynote Smackdown. Short presentations by many people who give keynotes to give sort of a short overview of what they talk about. I think you'll find that a lot of fun. There's also obviously going to be the Bloggers Cafe. If you've been there before, you know this. And something called ISTE Unplugged. I think this is our 3rd year with ISTE Unplugged. If you've never presented before or have something to present that didn't get into the program, you can do so live there at our ISTE Unplugged session. We've also announced the dates for the 2011 Global Education Conference, 5 days in November, 24 hours a day. This was a terrific event last year. It should be just the same this year. www.globaleducationconference.com. Sure look forward to having you there. Coming up on the Future of Education on Thursday, Chris Guillebeau on the Art of Nonconformity, his book, a very popular book. Then next week, Steve Denning on Radical Management, and Sir Ken Robinson on the revision of his book, Out of Our Minds. May 31st, James Bosco asks, is there participatory learning? That should be fun. Then we have an unschooling panel, Cal Newport on his book, How to Be a High School Superstar. And then, Mark, you should enjoy this. We have the authors of The Invisible Gorilla coming on, part of my series on cognitive issues. Anyway, lots more on that schedule. You're going to make a comment there, Mark?
No, just saying that's a great lineup of people, especially the Sabri and Simons on The Invisible Gorilla. Sounds great.
Oh, good. Well, it's a personal interest of mine, which is why you're here. If you've missed the show, they're all recorded, including our show last week with Paul Kimmelman on the School Leadership Triangle. Fascinating show. Paul's not that well known. Does kind of balance himself between educational reformers and the legislators. A fascinating take on educational reform and what we should do at this point. Hugh McGuire on just a lovely project, LibriVox, the crowdsourced recording. He doesn't use the word crowdsourced, I use that, but his volunteer recording efforts. Then we had the Passion Panel, lots more, all of it up on futureofeducation.com in full Illuminate recordings and also in MP3 formats. If this is your first time in Illuminate, it is participative. I won't show you all the tools, but I will recommend that you go up to View Layouts, switch yourself to the wide layout. We have some repeat listeners who can help you out if you run into any problems. But in the wide layout, it is easier to see the chat. At the bottom of the participant window, you'll notice some emoticons, smiley face, clapping hand. The hand with the green up arrow is how you'd raise your hand to take the microphone. You'll be asking for the microphone. We'll give it to you to ask a question if you have one for Mark. I'm going to give you permissions now to modify the whiteboard, and you can let us know where you're listening from. Click on the wand, that's the stick with the red star at the end, and then click on the map. Feel free to also shout out in the chat. For those of you who are listening to the audio recording, we'll tell you some of what comes up. Phoenix, Arizona. Looks like a couple in New Zealand, Australia, Fayetteville, North Carolina, Brookfield, Wisconsin, Melbourne, Fort Wayne, Wellington, Omaha, Nebraska, Spencer, Indiana, Auckland. Wherever you're listening from, or if you're listening to the recording, we're sure glad to have you here. Lots in North America. And if you're in rainy Northern California, you know what I'm talking about. So, Mark, again, really appreciate your coming on. This was a fascinating book for me, and it's part of sort of a larger set of reading that I've been doing on kind of where we are in terms of cognitive science. The book reads more like Dale Carnegie than it does a scientific book. Why did you make that choice, and how do you think it's helped kind of communicate the message?
Well, I think an important part of what we're trying to do with the Winner's Brain is to make some of the latest neuroscience findings accessible to the public at large. With the advances that we've had in technology, especially in things like magnetic resonance imaging, our ability to really get glimpses at the healthy, functioning brain for the first time, getting some information that really we've never been able to get before. And to be honest, I'm so excited about the things that we're finding, and it comes a point where you're like, well, we need to let everybody else know about this. And one of the fundamental challenges as a scientist is to be able to take your work and to translate it and make it accessible for other people. And so that's really what we're aiming for with the Winner's Brain, and I'm happy to hear the comparison. One of the marks for me, sort of personal pride, was my dad took a look at the manuscript shortly before we sent it off the final, and he said, he took a look at it, he said, this is amazing. It's the first time you've written anything that you've written that I've actually been able to understand. So that was a great stroke for me in terms of being able to really communicate with everybody else.
It felt to me like a lot of the messages in the book, and we'll drill down on them, very much reflect some of our cultural sort of institutions or stories that we tell ourselves or ways of doing things, the cultural and religious traditions. How much did you find that the brain is reconfirming common sense, and where did you find that common sense was wrong?
Well, I think in some of the things when we talk about common sense, things like when you look at self-regulation or emotional regulation, certainly we know, for ages that people have talked about the value of discipline and the value of hard work. And that certainly comes through in the research that we looked at for the Winner's Brain. Bottom line, when it comes to improving ourselves, when it comes to becoming successful, and that's really what the Winner's Brain is about, is each of us having our own objectives, our own personal goals, and what are the things that are going to help us to achieve those goals. And it doesn't come easy. So it takes that hard work, it takes that dedication. So in terms of common sense, that absolutely makes sense. There's nothing particularly new there, but I think it's important to remind ourselves of that message. When it comes to where common sense maybe falls a little bit, I think in, again, something like self-regulation. For years we've thought that people who weren't able to, control their emotions, who weren't able to, put off eating that delicious piece of cake in order to, fit with some objective that they want about eating healthy or exercise. We've looked at these as lack of willpower, as though it's some sort of moral defect of character. But really, by learning a little bit about the brain, learning about how things like self-control and self-regulation work, then not only are we able to understand those situations in which we have failures of that, but we can also see ways in which we can each do better and improve our ability at self-control and not going for that immediate gratification, putting that off for longer-term goals.
I was interested in the degree to which tying specific behaviors and practices to the brain, to thinking of the brain as a muscle rather than set like bone, that it put it within the context of not looking for silver bullets. So do you see that? Do you see that we often sometimes look for ways to kind of improve in performance or make things better without going through the hard work?
Well, I think that's what we would all like. We have this natural aversion to hard work, and I've actually written about that a little bit too. Why is it that we always want the easy route? And part of that is the way that we've evolved. We don't want to expend unneeded energy, and historically through evolution, there's adaptive benefit to that. So we want the easy fix, but it's important for us to realize that the easy fix isn't what's going to make the difference, especially when it comes to things like neuroplasticity. And I think that's really what you're getting at with this. The brain isn't hardwired for life once you get beyond adolescence. And importantly, that was the received view until about 10, 15 years ago, we used to think that once you got past adolescence that the brain was hardwired and incapable of change. But with these great examples, people like the drivers of the black cabs in London, these individuals who spend a lot of time training with spatial navigation and route memorization. And what we see is in these individuals, areas like the hippocampus, which is critical for memory and spatial navigation, is larger. And the bottom line, what we do with our brains and how we engage them, not only can we get better at a given skill, but we can literally reshape the physical landscape of the brain itself. But coming back to this idea about hard work, what we see is, in the case of those drivers of the black cabs in London, they train for a very long time. And so we see any sort of long-lasting change is the sort of change that comes through that repeated practice, through that dedication. But that said, some of the more recent work has shown that you can get neuroplastic changes actually on fairly short time scale. Things like learning how to juggle, you can see changes in density of the outer covering of the brain, the cortex, regions of the cortex. You can see these structural changes within fairly short time courses. So we know that what we do can have an effect early on, but if we want to have long-lasting change, that's where it takes the hard work and the dedication.
I'm intrigued by the degree to which the internet has become a part of this story, both sometimes being compared to how our brain works, but also seeming to present a variety of new circumstances that feel as though they're almost sort of reshaping how we use our brains. When you think about the impact of the internet and sort of web culture, do you feel overall that the positives outweigh the negatives? Are there specific themes that you look at when you think about interaction with the internet?
Well, I think overall what the internet has brought to us is access to information that we never had before. And access to information is a good thing. From an educator's point of view, that's what we want. We want people to have access to that information, especially when that information can be used in positive ways. So on the upside, our ability to learn, our ability to look things, within a moment's notice, I think that's all, hugely beneficial. Our ability to communicate with people around the world, it's, to be honest, kind of inspiring when you put up that map of the world and you see people joining in from all over the world in this conversation that we're having tonight even. So our ability to make those connections, again, about disseminating information, about taking good ideas and spreading them quickly, the internet's been very, very valuable. I think part of maybe what you're hinting at with how it's changed the way that we use our brains in large part is, again, also about communication. So you'll hear things about, Facebook and social media and the fact that we spend all of our time communicating with each other through a computer rather than with face-to-face interaction. And there probably is some downside to that. Face-to-face social interaction is obviously very valuable. So overall, I'm not sure that I would necessarily put a value judgment, but one part's good, one part's bad, but instead just looking at what we have available to us and, in many ways, needing to adapt to that and looking for ways to make the best use of technology and the internet, but also being mindful and being aware of those situations in which maybe it won't have the best benefit. So making sure that we still get out and have that face-to-face interaction with friends and neighbors and things like that.
You mentioned the work that Gary Small has done in looking at brains when they're searching the internet. I'm going to tell you how I interpreted that, and I'm curious to see if I'm even close to what your sort of scientific perspective would be. So these were brain scans done of people who had developed patterns of searching on the internet. I think this was not new for first-time searchers, but people who were used to searching on the internet. And it showed high levels of activity. And I feel as though my brain's actually changed because of my ability to search through and weave through different topics on the internet in such a way that I even read books differently now. I think I'm a more proactive reader of any material, not just the internet. Do you think I've interpreted that correctly, or how would you interpret that?
Well, certainly what you're saying makes sense. The whole idea about neuroplasticity, this coming back to what I said about the way that you engage your brain can literally reshape your brain, it makes sense. If you're using a mode of thought all the time as you search through the internet, as you think about ways to access information, that's going to have lingering effects in other ways in which you're acquiring information, and reading a book might be one of those things. So certainly what we do on a daily basis, how we use technology, how we use the internet, how we search for information, just being aware that there's even answers. Now we can, go and Google something where before we might not have even thought that, there was an answer to the question. And now it's so easy to do that. Why not try and figure that out? So yeah, I think your interpretation is probably head on, spot on in terms of what we do having a lingering impact. And it's good to hear that, at least from your perspective, that you're finding that that's making you more proactive, that you're getting more out of other forms of media, books, and other sources of information.
At the same time, you also address in the book what you call, I got to make sure I have the right wording here, the double whammy of incompetence. And I'm reminded of the Stanford study that showed that those who thought they were the best multitaskers were in fact actually the worst. Just to what degree is the distraction of the internet changing our ability to be good thinkers?
Well, I think coming back to this idea about the double whammy of incompetence, in the literature, this is known as the Kruger-Dunning effect, where, yeah, exactly, the people who think that they're the best at something are very often, not so good. In fact, really, it's the people who do the worst on any given test, and you ask them, how do you think you've done? It turns out not only are they not good at that task, but they think that they're doing fine. So the double whammy of incompetence. One, they're incompetent at the task, but they're also incompetent at knowing their limitations. So where this comes into things like the internet, distractions, technology, really I think part of it is that it's about how we use technology, how we use the internet. I write a column for the Globe and Mail, the Better Brain column, and one of the columns recently was about asking the question about whether relying on gadgets is making us stupid. And really this comes down to the fact that if we hand off all of these difficult, mentally challenging tasks, like remembering somebody's phone number or whether or not I've got a meeting at 2 p.m., if we hand all of these things off to technology, these are the sorts of things that require effortful cognitive control, that require working memory, that require me to be able to focus my attention on one thing and resist temptation or to eliminate, distraction from other tasks. So we know that exercising that cognitive control then makes you stronger, makes you better able to exert cognitive control in situations where you really need it. So on one hand, yeah, we want to be careful if we're handing off all of these activities to Google, to our iPhone, to different devices. Well, what are we doing to make sure that we're still giving ourselves those mental challenges, that we're still exerting cognitive control and keeping, using the metaphor of a muscle, keeping those muscles strong, those cognitive mental muscles, so to speak. The counter argument to that is, well, by me handing off these telephone numbers, dates, things like that, I'm allowing myself to free up those mental resources to be able to deal with things that are truly important. So instead of having to keep track of my schedule, I can now think about other areas about cognitive neuroscience and ways to make our brains better. It's not about, I think, at the end of the day, whether technology is good or bad or, having a negative impact, but for each of us to be thinking, well, if I'm handing one activity off, onto my gadget, then what are the other things that I'm doing to make sure that I'm still providing myself with the mental challenges, with that mental exercise that I need to keep sharp in other areas.
So I don't want to get too far ahead here because we will get to the meat of the book. But it occurred to me sort of at the end of the book, I really enjoyed Dan Ariely's, what's his book? Predictably Irrational. And one of the things I took away from the book was, to the degree that we're aware of how our brain can often trick us, we sort of supersede that unconscious mistake making. And I left your book feeling very much like one of the big takeaways is just an awareness of our ability to actually kind of watch our cognitive functioning, think about how to make it better, and then actually take steps to make it better.
Exactly. And I think this is a big part of where you talked about the double whammy of incompetence, and that idea really fits in with the whole notion of self-awareness. The fact that in order for us to, improve ourselves, in order to figure out what we need to be more successful, we first have to do that reflection, have that assessment, that sense of awareness of what are the things that I'm good at, what are the things that I'm not so good at, what are the things that I need to focus on in terms of improving. And I think that absolutely, fits very well. And a lot of the mental strategies throughout the winner's brain really focus on identifying what are the things that you're good at, what are the things that you're not so good at, seeking feedback. Beyond the science that we had in the winner's brain, which was really, from my perspective, is really one of the strengths of the book, is making sure that it's science-based. But beyond that, we also interviewed a number of well-known people, and people like B.B. King, and talking to them about their successes and the things that fit. And one of the things that struck me from talking with all these people is the extent to which they talked about seeking feedback, even if it was negative feedback. Tell me honestly, how was that performance? Or tell me, did I do okay there? And really developing fairly thick skins in terms of, just tell me it, like it is, so that I know the things to focus on and the things that I need to make better.
Meaning, I don't want to be in that double whammy of incompetence. So please tell me. Please tell me.
Exactly. And that's, the merits of, even if it's a little bit painful to hear that you're not quite as good yet at something that you've been practicing, the sting of that, of that news ultimately is you're going to benefit from that. So you'll be able to go back and practice a little bit more, or see ways in which you can improve to become more efficient, to become more effective, ways in which you're, not exerting control in the ways that you think that you maybe are. And that's really critical to be able to improve in each of these different areas that we see as being critical for success.
So I want to bring up two more kind of elements of the internet technology and culture before we move on. One is that I feel as though there are certain tools that I've started using on the computer that have a symbiotic relationship with my brain functioning. One is Evernote. It's the ability to sort of keep notes, sort them, catalog them, find them very easily through a search. Are you sort of noticing that the tools, that these sort of new extensions of our brain are reshaping how we think? Well, I haven't done any research on that myself, but certainly there are people who are looking at these things. And certainly we can see, even if you forget about the idea about gadgets or technology to begin with, what we know is that, again, how you use your brain, that has an impact. If I'm doing, one task, it takes a little while for the brain to get in the groove, so to speak. A great example that I use for this is when I was a student, I'd study for a few days before an exam, and it takes a little while to really start making the connections between the ideas, but because you sit there and you're so focused, because it takes a while to get, in many ways that you can think of the brain as like a big ship. It takes a while to get that momentum going, for everything to start working and synchronize it in sync. But then the follow-up to that is that it keeps working in that fashion. You develop this sort of cognitive style that keeps going. And the best example of this is after the exam. Now that I'm finished, I've done the exam, I'm still thinking about these things. I still wake up in the middle of the night, with this, I've got the solution to this problem. And you're like, I don't even need to really be thinking about this anymore. I'm finished the test, but it just reflects the fact that, once we get going in a specific mode of thinking, that we adapt to that style and we keep going with that style. So if that's about organizing, sources of information, if that's about finding, a bit of information amongst a bunch of other things, that very well could influence the way that you approach other situations. And probably the best carryover to that is when we think about, and we talked about the brain as being sort of like a muscle, and we want to flex that muscle. Really, for the most part, when we talk about that muscle, that's really about cognitive control. That's really about any sort of situation where you have to exert effortful, sort of cognitive, deliberate sort of thing. So whether that's about paying attention to one source of information, you're having a conversation with somebody, how do you eliminate distraction? Or if you're working, how do you resist the distraction from outside sources?
If it's about working memory, how do you keep one bit of information in mind in the face of all of these other competing bits of information that want access to what you're thinking about? Right down to making decisions in terms of what you're going to eat. If you're trying to eat healthy, how do you resist this other competing signal that we have? And in many ways, you can think of the brain as being a battleground. We have all of these competing signals, and when we talk about cognitive control, this is really about us being able to strategically bias which of those competing signals is going to drive our behavior, is going to form the content of our thoughts and thoughts and behavior. And so really this is part of what we're talking about, is developing this cognitive control, flexing this muscle, because what we want is carryover effects. So I noticed that somebody on the message on the chat mentioned something about meditation. And meditation is one of these great examples where the task itself, which is really about sitting quietly and practicing control over what you're attending to, and exerting control over your emotional response. So you're focusing your attention on one thing, and if your attention drifts away, you gently bring it back to what you're trying to focus on in this non-judgmental way. So it's really about practicing attentional control and emotional control. But the thing is that the goal isn't just to get better at meditating. Instead, what we see is these massive carryover effects where now people are better able to regulate their emotional responses to things. They're better able to deal with stressful situations. They're better able to focus and pay attention to things, and better attentional control. And all of these is because what meditation is doing, it seems, is flexing this cognitive control muscle. So now when you're out in the real world in these situations where you need that cognitive control, whether it's emotional regulation, paying attention to something, concentrating, now you're better able to do that.
Yeah, that in particular was fascinating to me, because I think you cite a researcher there who actually shows demonstrable changes in brain size of parts of the brain from meditation.
That's right. Sarah Lazar, before I came to the University of Guelph, I was at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital, and Sarah Lazar is one of the people who I worked with there, and she has done a lot of work with meditation, and especially some of her most recent work I find very compelling with people like Holtzman and all. And so what they show is you bring in people who go to a stress reduction workshop and they learn to do meditation, and you do a scan of their brain before the workshop and a scan of it after. So you're looking at 6 to 8 weeks of practicing meditation for maybe 10, 15, up to a half hour a day. And what you see is an increase in cortical thickness in some areas associated with self-awareness. So a big part of meditation is focusing your attention on something. Oftentimes it's something related to the body, your breath, something like that. So you see increases in cortical thickness in the insula, which is an area associated with your bodily awareness or self-awareness, and in areas of prefrontal cortex associated with attentional control. But interestingly, what you see is also a decrease in the density of areas like the amygdala. And this is interesting because we know that one of the consequences of stress, of chronic stress, is that when we're stressed, we have this emotional response that leads to overactivation of the amygdala. So with chronic stress, we see an increase in density of the amygdala. So these people who meditate, they go through the stress reduction workshop, we see a decrease in the density of the amygdala, and importantly, the decrease is associated with the decrease in stress that people experience. So those people who report the greatest decrease in stress in their day-to-day life after doing this workshop and learning to meditate, those are the people who see the largest decrease in the density of the amygdala. So part of what meditation is doing is reconfiguring the way that you think, reconfiguring sort of your approach to day-to-day situations. So instead of reacting in this very emotional, stressed out response to everything, you're better able to exert control and be able to have a measured response to these things. And it's having changes not only in terms of their day-to-day functioning, their experience of well-being, but also literally in reshaping the physical landscape of the brain itself.
So Peggy's asking if the benefit comes only during the meditating, and I think that's the sort of the core story, which is no, it's not just the meditating, but it appears to have then a measurable effect on certain other kinds of tasks you do at different times, right, Mark?
That's right, exactly. That's the best part of meditation, is that it's not just that you're getting better at meditating, but it's these carryover effects, the fact that in your day-to-day life afterwards that you're seeing all of these benefits. And I see Randall's asking about music, whether it's also got similar benefits. And music, playing music, actively participating in music also has benefits. Some of the benefits are similar to what you would see with meditation in terms of attentional control. So we see studies where people who learn to play a musical instrument have better auditory attention, better able to focus in on, somebody speaking, let's say in a noisy crowd would be an example of that auditory attention. Verbal memory, auditory short-term memory, things like that we see increases with in benefits of playing music.
So there was one more piece from sort of culture that I wanted to bring up. I've approached reality shows with an enormous amount of skepticism, but my children and my wife have sort of increasingly exposed me to the cooking shows and the dance shows and American Idol. And I'm intrigued by something, the connection that you helped me make here, which was that in those shows, I actually see a couple of things that seem to be very key to your work. One of which is I see how hard they work to get the skills, but that they can gain the skills. And the other I see is that I can watch their reactions, and you can see how certain reactions lead to sort of positive benefits and other reactions lead to negative ones. And intriguingly, after watching these shows, I actually feel like I'm understanding my own brain a little bit better and how I might want to react or respond in circumstances.
Well, I think that's a great example. And in fact, in The Winner's Brain, when we talk about self-awareness, we start that chapter off by talking about a robot. And this robot, Leo, who's built by MIT Personal Robotics Lab. And what's interesting about Leo is that he's one of the first robots to be programmed to be socially aware, to be able to, in many ways, simulate the mental state of somebody else. And this is really part of what I picked up of what you're saying about reality shows, is that by watching other people, we can gain some insight about ourselves. And one of the critical, new findings in neuroscience that's related to this is mirror neurons. So mirror neurons are these neurons that have been discovered. They were first discovered in motor areas in monkeys. And so basically, these were neurons that Rizzolatti and colleagues were recording to see what exactly are the neural operations involved in reaching out and grabbing something. And they found these neurons that were selectively tuned to what they thought only respond when the monkey was reaching out and grabbing a piece of food. But one of the ways that you measure the responses from these neurons is you hook them up to a loudspeaker. So you can hear every time that the neuron fires, it comes across as a click on the auditory speaker. And they left the neuron hooked up to the auditory speaker as the research assistant was going about cleaning up. And as he reached out and grabbed the piece of food, this neuron went nuts and started firing. So basically what they found was this neuron that not only fires when you're doing an action, but also fires when somebody else is doing an action. Another way of thinking about it is that every time that you watch somebody else do something, you're mentally simulating or doing the same thing on a mental scale yourself. And so we can see this as being critical for things like imitative learning. How do you learn something from somebody else? It's always easiest many times by watching them, especially if it's something procedural. We watch them do it, and the reason that that's so much easier for us to do it now is because we've done it on a mental scale already, so it bridges that gap. And so we can see this in terms of learning. We can also see this in terms of emotional responses. When somebody has, something tragic happen to them, we feel sad or we feel, empathy for them. Well, how is it that we have that empathic response? Is we're simulating what it must feel like as if that's happening to ourselves. And so where we tie this to self-awareness is that we can learn a lot about ourselves by watching other people, by virtue of the fact that by watching them, we're simulating it again as if we're doing it on this mental scale. And so we can use that as a tool to gain insight on, what kind of a response would I have in this reaction? If the judge is kind of harsh and is mean on one of these shows, how would I feel in that situation? And I think especially what you said is in how these people respond Do they get upset? Do they pout and storm off stage? Or are they able to take that feedback in a constructive way, find ways to be resilient, bounce back, and to improve?
Yeah, I love the growth and improvement that's so visible in those shows. So let's shift a little to education here. My summary of the book would be that using your brain to learn how to respond to situations and challenges that you face in life brings you success, and that we can look at other people who have done this and we can emulate that behavior in ourselves, and that we can learn these skills. So should this be a part of education, and is it becoming it anywhere in your own career? Have you watched any schools trying to adopt some of the conclusions from this work in terms of what they actually do in schooling?
Well, probably the best connection that I have in terms of education. So I think the bottom line is, yes, there's educators who are keenly interested in what's going on in terms of neuroscience and the new discoveries that we have, and finding ways for us to be able to apply this in educational situations. I just spoke last week, I guess just over a week ago, at the Learning in the Brain conference. Was in Chicago, about the science of student success, and I was very impressed there in terms of the conversations that I had with educators afterwards, in terms of their willingness and their enthusiasm for, what is it that we're learning about the brain? How does that reflect on, whether it's, how to teach a math class and reduce math anxiety, to how do we deal with disruptive behavior. One of the things that I talked about was related to self-regulation, and this idea that when it comes to, being able to control ourselves, being able to, behave in a classroom situation, again, that's about exerting cognitive control. And one of the things that we know about self-regulation is that takes effort. That takes, it's difficult, and it takes brain fuel. It takes glucose, blood glucose. And so what we see work by people like Roy Baumeister and colleagues shows that when we have low blood glucose, that we are more susceptible to failures of self-regulation. And so there was a paper that came out just a couple months ago by Shai Danziger and colleagues, where they were looking at judges. And when you think about it, judges are people who are professional decision makers, people who are masters of self-control. Their job is to be objective in looking at different sources of evidence. And what Danziger and colleagues showed was that when it came to parole cases, the difficult decisions that they had to make, that was, in terms of whether or not somebody should be granted parole, that the amount of time that had elapsed since the last meal critically determined the chances of success for these individuals. So the longer that it had been since a break and a meal, the less time that the judges spent considering the case, and the less favorable the outcome for the person who was being considered. And the effect was huge. And so part of why I bring this up, and why I showed it at the Learning in the Brain conference, was to say, look, if judges, these adults who are, masters of self-control, if they're so susceptible to the effect of low blood sugar, the fact that with low blood sugar, without a break, fatigue, that combination really creates failures of self-control, failures of cognitive control. And if judges are that susceptible, well, what about kids in your class who maybe haven't had a decent breakfast that morning? And not to mention other kids in your class who might already be facing challenges with behavioral control, cognitive control, learning disabilities, things like that.
So what about medication? In the book you discuss how in certain circumstances I can't remember if it was exercise or what it was, but there was actually a reduction in the need for some of the control medications that are typically used with students, like Ritalin. But on the other side, a book I really enjoyed was Temple Grandin's book, where she discussed the sort of the liberating aspects of how medication really helped her to kind of get her brain into the right space. How do you feel about medication in this arena?
Well, I think coming back to the example that you mentioned in the book, we talked about Alison Cameron, and so she's an educator in Canada who had a group of students who really were sort of challenging students to deal with, and and she implemented this exercise program. So we now know, and in fact, this is one of the things that have had the biggest impact on me personally, and the changes that I've made myself as a function of writing The Winner's Brain and working on it, is realizing that physical exercise is not just good for the body. It's not just for keeping our heart healthy and making sure that we're not obese and diabetes and things like that, but that physical exercise is actually very critical for healthy brain functioning too. So work by people like Art Kramer at the University of Illinois shows quite strong effects that where things like cognitive training, doing maybe crossword puzzles, things like this can have benefits in terms of being better at that task. Physical exercise is again one of these things that we can do that has benefits across the board. And so Alison Cameron is that example of someone where by implementing physical exercise in the classroom, now found that behavior improved, grades improved, and that's where we noted that a lot of the students there no longer needed to be on medication. Coming back to the point about, how do I feel about medication? I think it's important to emphasize I'm not a medical doctor. I don't have training or specific expertise there, but from my limited perspective, that said, I think that there certainly are situations where medication is helpful. But I also think that it's important for us to use all of the tools at our disposal. So we don't want to rely only on one thing or another. So especially when you think about some of the cutbacks that we've had in education, very often they're geared towards things like physical education and music programs. These examples that we're finding are very critical. What are the best examples that we have of neuroplasticity, the way that people can preserve brain functioning or enhance brain functioning? It's things like playing a musical instrument by doing physical exercise. So, I think that's part of what we can use, where the research can help to inform what we do in schools, how we make decisions about which programs to have in place and things like that.
Sort of a fascinating conclusion that might be drawn is that in our desire to increase accountability in test scores, we may be doing away in many schools, with the very things that would actually create improvement.
Well, yes, and I mentioned a bit about the learning in the brain, and this was certainly one of the sentiments that I heard quite a bit is, we know that taking tests is beneficial. We know just from the memory literature, from the cognitive psychology literature on memory, that one of the best things that you can do to improve your memory for something is to repeatedly test it. The act of retrieval helps you to consolidate and to make a stronger, more durable memory for something. So tests are good, but the standardized tests, where it's not directly related to course content, where it doesn't have the goal, that's specifically about the course and the material that's there, that doesn't seem to be quite as beneficial. So yeah, I think some of the policies that have been put in place in many ways, despite our best intentions, can sometimes, like you say, have some negative consequences.
Okay, well, as usual, I have gone down some paths of great interest to me without giving you a chance to really describe the structure and light of the book. But let's do that for a couple of minutes, and then we have some questions. You first described 5 brain power tools. Would you like to give an overview of that?
Sure. Yeah, and just as a brief overview of what the winner's brain is basically looking at, well, what does brain science tell us about people, the brains that excel in what we see as being key areas related to success, and then what can we learn from that science that gives us some tips about the sorts of things that each of us can be doing to enhance our own brain function. And so we talk about these brain power tools, and these are really kind of 5 elements that we see as being critical for success, regardless of what your definition of success is. And we don't have a set definition that it's about earning money or about getting straight A's. We realize that each individual has their own personal goals, their own personal objectives, things that they would like to accomplish. And the brain power tools, and we talk about the win factors after, we see these as really being critical regardless of what your goal is or what you see as being successful. So the brain power tools, we talk about things like your ability to recognize opportunities. We see that as being really critical, and a lot of times that those opportunities aren't necessarily dressed up as, here's a great opportunity, come take advantage of me. There's great examples. We're not the first to note, but people like George de Mestral, the inventor of Velcro, who has these thistle burrs stuck on his socks after a hike and on his dog after a hike in the mountains. And instead of just being annoyed like many of us would, instead he sees this as an opportunity. He has an insight about the way to take advantage of this. So recognizing opportunities, being able to have optimal risk, being able to say, okay, here's an opportunity, but what are the risks that are involved? There's a whole field now that's developed of neuroeconomics. And neuroeconomics is really all about being able to evaluate a situation. What are the pros? What are the costs? What are the pros, the cons, the costs, the benefits? And we need to be able to assess these things when we go in. So we talk about areas like the nucleus accumbens, the ventral striatum, in terms of evaluating potential rewards of a situation. And where neuroeconomists are really interested in about this is, what are the neural processes that are going on when we decide whether to buy or sell a stock, or whether as consumers we buy product A or product B. But really the same principles go into any of the decisions that we make. We come to every situation where we evaluate something. Even if it's something like, I talked about this natural aversion to expending energy. It's always been a bit of a mystery for me why, and I mentioned that exercise is one of these things that I was really impressed with writing the book, so I started to run. And when I'm running, I love it. It's a very rewarding experience. I get in this little zone. I'm free from a lot of, the stresses of day-to-day life. But before I go running, when I think, I should really go for a run tonight, the thought of running can be quite aversive, even though the act of running itself can be quite rewarding. So what is it about the thought of running that's so aversive? And I think it comes down to this thing that we don't want to needlessly expend energy. So part of the evaluation of whether I go running or not is to remind myself of those benefits. And so this is part of when we talk about optimal risk, not just for running, but for any sort of situation. We have to take risks when it comes to being successful. If you don't take risks, if you don't get into what psychologists talk about as a promotion focus, but instead if you're always seeking safety and avoiding risk, then we don't get anywhere. So that's part about optimal risk. We talk about locking onto goals, and this is really in part about, what are the goals that we have. We talked about self-awareness a little bit earlier, and we talked about success as being kind of personal to everybody having their own objectives. But a key part of this is, what is it that you want to achieve? So often we see that we can get, in the rut of our day-to-day lives, going in a routine without thinking, what's the bigger objective here? What exactly is it that we want to accomplish? So self-awareness helps for that. And then once we have those goals, what are the things that we need to do to be able to lock onto them and to keep going, whether that's in the face of adversity and things like that. So effort accelerator is another one, which is about motivation. Talent meter, again, fits into the idea about self-awareness, learning the things that we're good at, but also identifying those things that we're not so good at. And so that wraps up those brain power tools that, again, just what we see as being critical elements for achieving any of the objectives that a person might have.
So the balance of the book then goes in depth into 8 what you call win factors. So how do those tools relate to the win factors?
Well, so each of the win factors, these are really what form each of the individual chapters. And so we can see things like the talent meter fitting in. The first of the win factors is self-awareness. We've talked quite a bit about self-awareness already, about that learning about yourself through watching other people. Another of the win factors is motivation. So what is it that we're learning about the brain in terms of what drives behavior? And a lot of this has to do with this system within the brain, the dopamine, mesolimbic dopamine system, that also involves part that we mentioned in terms of neuroeconomics, like the ventral striatum, that helps us to evaluate potential reward, potential costs of things. Focus, attention, is another one of the factors. So when we talk about locking onto goals, a big part of that is about being able to focus and resist being distracted and resist being interrupted by other things going on. And one of the key things when it comes to focus is, I noticed somebody had a question about what's going on in the brain when we get in the groove, when we get into that kind of flow state. And a big part of this is related to the idea about focus. And where it's related is that sometimes we can focus too hard on something. We talked about cognitive control. We know that with attention, we can have either a fairly broad focus where we're able to take in lots of details in our surroundings, or we can have a very narrow focus. And sometimes when it comes to solving a problem, it's not the narrow focus where we're really strongly focused on one thing, but instead it's where we need to broaden our focus a little bit. So one story or one observation, I guess, that's related to this is, it always struck me, I've got, a research lab, I've got an office, I've got thousands of dollars of equipment that's really, I'm a professor, it's really dedicated to coming up with good ideas. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit the amount of time that I spend staring at my computer screen, really having this kind of block. And yet, when I wake up in the morning, I jump in the shower, I'm amazed at this sort of stream of consciousness that I have, this flow of thinking, where I can, in the course of 5 minutes, plan my day, have some insight on some problem that's been bothering me. So it always kind of, intrigued me, like, what exactly is it about the shower? Why do my best ideas come up in the shower? And in part, it's because the shower is one of those situations where there's nothing really demanding. I don't have to focus very hard on any of the given tasks that I have. So I'm able to relax. I'm able to broaden my focus a little bit. And so we know that parts of the brain, it's actually called the default network, sort of what is the brain doing when it's not doing anything else, when it's not actively engaged in a cognitively demanding task. And parts of that default network are critical for associative processing, for being able to make connections between things that otherwise you might see as being unrelated. So that's where we have great insight and sort of creativity, or in these situations where we can relax a little bit and release some of that cognitive control for those areas of the brain to become more active and start making those associations. So when we talk about flow state or getting into the groove, we can see examples of this in improvisation. So a great study by Charles Lim and his colleague looked at people jazz musicians who improvise in the scanner. And what they found is those situations where they're improvising, which is really composing on the fly, compared to a situation where they're just playing a tune wrote by memory, is that you have a decrease in activity in regions of the brain associated with cognitive control and increases in activity in some of these areas associated with this default network. And so really what we see is in that flow state is turning down some of that cognitive control and allowing some of these other areas to become more active. And so part of that is what we talk about in this focus chapter. The other brain factors we talk about, this WIN factor, is about emotional balance. We've talked again a little bit about the idea about emotional balance as it relates to self-regulation, but also how, our ability to look at a situation, the critical role of things like reframing. So, Jeff Brown is the other author on the book. Where I'm the cognitive neuroscience, you can think of me, I guess, as more of the brain guy on the book. Jeff Brown is a cognitive behavioral psychologist. So he spends his days helping people to think about situations in different ways. And this is really, part of this is about reframing. So what we see is approaching a situation instead of responding in a very emotional way is to be able to look at it in a new way, can literally reconfigure the patterns of activation that we have in the brain. So changing, if it's a stressful situation, being able to look at it in more objective terms, now we down-regulate the activity in areas like the amygdala. So emotional balance, memory is another one of the WIN factors. We talk about things like the critical role of memory, where in the past we've thought about memory as being critical for reminiscing about, Sunday dinners at grandma's house or things in the past. And really the shift that we've had really over the last 4 or 5 years in thinking about memory, not as something that allows us to think about the past, but instead as something that helps to prepare us for the future. So we have this critical overlap in regions of the brain that are involved in thinking about the past, and also that help us to anticipate or to imagine or to simulate what's going on in the future. So really, it's about memory as being able to, take our past experience, and now we can apply it to new situations through analogy that help us to anticipate what's going to happen in this new situation, so we're prepared for it and best able to handle it. So that's part of what we talked about with memory. Resilience, being able to bounce back in the face of failure. How do you take a situation where you've made a mistake or an error, learn from those mistakes, being able to move on. How people who are low in resilience, they really have difficulty disengaging from their mistakes. A great example we talk about is work by Christian Waugh and colleagues, where you split people up into high and low resilience using a psychometric scale, a psychological scale that identifies high and low resilient people. And now you present these people with a cue that gives them some information. It says, so if you see a square, that means you have a 50% chance of either seeing a really nasty image or something that's affectively neutral. And in the face of that cue, everybody has an increase in activation of areas like the amygdala, and that's a natural stress response. It helps us to deal with things that are going on in our surroundings. But what they noticed was that the people who are highly resilient, as soon as the image turned out to be a neutral image, there really was no problem, they very quickly came back down to baseline in terms of their response in areas like the amygdala and insula, these stress-related areas, where the low resilient people, their brain activation just kept being ramped up for quite a long time. And when I read this paper, it really resonated well with me because I know people like this. It's you almost get in a car accident or something, and instead of saying, oh, wow, that was close, we need to be a little bit more careful in how we drive, they spend the next 15 minutes going, oh, my goodness, I can't believe we almost got in the accident. Can you imagine what would have happened if we would have got in that accident? That would have been so horrible. And they spend the time focused on what almost happened instead of being able to recognize it for what it is and move on. So that's part of what we talk about in the resilience win factor. Adaptability really is a big part of that, is the idea about neuroplasticity, which we've talked about quite a bit. And then brain care. What are the things that we need to do in terms of how we eat, how we sleep, how we feed the brain, mental stimulation, things like that help us to keep our brains working at their very best. And so between this, and just the last thing to mention here about the book is, the key piece is about the science. What's the latest neuroscience telling us about the brains of people who work well in terms of self-awareness, motivation, focus? Then what are the mental strategies that each of us can do to make our brains work a little bit better? But then we also have these interviews with fairly well-known people, as well as just what we call winners next door, examples of people who are clearly successful, even though they might not be that well known, to illustrate sort of the science in action.
So for me, kind of the great takeaway was that we have a lot more capability to determine how to use our brains and to improve their function. That the science is backing up, a lot of what we have sort of culturally believed, although there have been cultural beliefs sort of against that, but the positive beliefs about our ability to change and make improvements. And then in a lot of ways, for me, the most powerful role of an adult in an educational or family situation is helping to model those improvements in how you respond to life and how you sort of actively care for, feed and care for and grow your brain. So I really appreciated the book. We're right at the top of the hour, so I'm going to start clapping for you. There was a comment, I think David in the chat said, I'm going to run out and buy this book. I'm sure that's the exact kind of thing you want to hear. I really enjoyed the book. I love the ideas, and I really appreciate your coming on and talking to us about them.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. And yeah, I think it's an exciting time in terms of neuroscience, what we're learning about the brain. Again, this is a big motivation for me in writing the book is, we're learning all of these things, and you can see the direct applicability for day-to-day life. And this is a big motivation for me, is to be able to get the word out. So I'm thrilled that people have been able to come on and be a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Mark. While I'm closing up, if you would like, feel free to put links in the chat for your website. There's a website for the Winner's Brain book, and if you're interested in having people contact you, an email address. Coming up on the Future of Education on Thursday, Chris Giobo on the Art of Nonconformity. Then next week, Steve Denning on Radical Management, and Sir Ken Robinson on Out of Our Minds. Thanks so much to Mark for being here tonight. The book is The Winner's Brain, 8 Strategies Great Minds Use to Achieve Success. Terrific conversation, and so significant in education. I hope we have more of these.
Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Mark. Okay, so our commitment is to let you go right on the hour. You've taken an hour, and we want to make sure we're respectful of your time. So for those of you who'd like to stick around for additional chat, we'll stay in the room for a few minutes. Otherwise, Mark, I really appreciate your participating tonight, and have a great evening.
Thanks again, and I hope everybody has a good night. Take care.
So that was really fun, and we didn't get to a lot that's in the book, so I hope that you'll consider picking it up. There were some pieces we didn't talk about that were fascinating to me, and I would have loved to have talked a little bit more about autism, because I think there were bits and pieces in the book, especially about facial recognition and recognition of emotions, that I think would be interesting. And that's a topic I think we're going to continue to see in education and see more commenting about. There's also the deliberate practice piece, which has been in so many of the interviews, from the talent code to the genius within all of us and the like. So this whole question of deliberate practice is clearly becoming a meme, a thought within the educational world, which is worth talking about. I'm particularly interested in sort of how we, in many ways, seem to be moving away from the kinds of practices that are implied by the book or specifically recommended in the book, and where schools are kind of bucking the trend and doing this. And I'm guessing it's largely in private or independent schools. Has anybody got any comments on that, or where you're seeing these kind of practices implemented in positive ways in education? Feel free to grab the mic. I'm just going to give everybody mic control. You can turn your mic on, or you can put a note in the chat. There's this fascinating degree to which we're almost sort of shooting ourselves in the foot by wanting more achievement, but having to do away with the things that might actually allow it. Larry, feel free just to turn your mic on. I've given everybody mic control. Do that by clicking on the microphone at the lower left of your screen, and I am seeing that you have some kind of a mic issue. So there you go.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There you go.
Okay, anyway, one of the people I've been reading or studying is a researcher out of Stanford called Dr. Carol Dweck, and she has a website called Brainology, where she's implementing some of these same ideas for elementary school children to help them understand their brain as a prelude to understanding school subjects and how to study. So it'd be really interesting to read some of her stuff. She has a book out called Mindset, as well as her website.
Thanks, Larry. Go ahead and turn your mic off because we're getting an echo. There we go. So Carol's actually been on the show to talk about mindset, and if you go to futureofeducation.com and look on the past interviews, there is an interview with her. I agree. And Carol ends up getting quoted by many, many people. I don't think she's mentioned specifically in The Winner's Brain, but I probably read her name once a week in some kind of material. Oh, thanks for the link there. There's also a new book out called Moonwalking with Einstein, about a guy who decides to become a memory expert, which I haven't read but have heard a little bit about. And that, along with the Polgar sisters, this chess family story that gets told a lot, really is an argument for the ability to become capable in an area which we previously thought was a natural skill, not necessarily an acquired one. One fun thing that Mark talks about in the book is having a failure role model. I have to say, mine is Abraham Lincoln. Just this idea that you can be resilient, and that we're not failure is not a sign that we're defective. I'm in the dangerous situation of reading. I'm listening to John Taylor Gatto's book, An Underground History of American Education, and it's so interesting to kind of hear him describe the degree to which we don't recognize how much the educational system was originally built on, has been perpetuated by this belief that most people aren't smart, and that ultimately the goal of the system is to identify the smart ones because the rest are not smart or defective. And I've never thought of it in those sort of stark negative terms, but very interesting to think about how we flee from failure for fear that it shows that we're one of the defective ones. One thing I would love to, it'd be fun to have Mark come back on the show, but the other piece I didn't get to get to was the whole Strengths Finders piece. Those of you who maybe heard Jennifer Fox talk about her school and your child's strengths and finding strengths and working on them, kind of an interesting parallel track here. I'm not sure entirely how it relates, but knowing that there's probably a lot of overlap in the two different ways of thinking about education. And he didn't mention it, but in his brain care section or chapter, he does talk about sleep and sort of the intriguing degree to which our brains don't. We need that sleep, and it's sort of very interesting. I almost feel as though if you focused on, and I'm really fascinated about this conference that he went to. I need to find out more about that. But that if you focused on the brain as sort of the driving idea behind an educational structure, how would you design your work, knowing that you're both wanting to provide for the right amount of opportunities for sleep and for exercise and the like, but also knowing the brain needs challenges and providing really disciplined challenges so that there is growth. I think it would be kind of fun to map that out. Well, nobody else is talking, although there is some commenting in the chat, but if anybody else has anything to say, please feel free to take the mic or put it in the chat, and we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes.
Steve, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Dave McGavick. It seems to me that we're so bent on production, and you say this, and a lot of the people you interview talk about this, is how bent we are on assessment and counting achievement. It just doesn't seem like there's much chance for a lot of these principles to get incorporated into a lot of our schools. I was thinking that you talk about the Declaration for Education. It'd be interesting to include these principles as kind of founding pieces of a declaration.
Yeah, I saw that note in the chat, and I appreciated it. No, that's a great thought. I've actually had an interesting, if you're tired of this conversation, please feel free to log off, but I'm going to move forward knowing that we're past our hour and we can take some liberties here. So the idea is to have an event after EduBloggerCon on Saturday night for ISTE to kind of create a declaration of education, do a future search or visioning of education. I spent some time the other day kind of mapping out how you would create a day in a community where you would do a series of exercises to kind of help people create that vision for education or their own personal education declaration. And it came to the conclusion that the best way to do that would be to create a framework and a structure with a certain number of ideas where people could indicate their own particular set of ideas, that at the end of the day they could then pick and choose and create their own personal education declaration. So they could walk away from the day either as a parent or a teacher or a student saying, this is now how I'm personally going to measure the activities that I'm involved in education, and felt really powerfully better about that than creating a single declaration. So I'm really curious to know your response to that, and does that actually resonate with you as well?
Well, it certainly puts a lot more responsibility on the individual, which in some ways it makes it more challenging, but it's probably more real that way. It would be, I guess, when I hear you speak of education declaration, I think of some sort of statement of principles that that the people who listen to your interviews, the people who are represented through this conversation, might form their thoughts. But that could be done with what you're describing, but then it would be more personal, and I think that's great.
Well, so one of the thoughts I've had is that I've watched this sort of reform movement and the dialogue or lack thereof between the reformers and traditionalists, or even between reformers. And I think, KIPP believes, the KIPP people believe they're reformers. The Teacher America believe they're reformers. Diane Ravitch believes she's a reformer. I think the surprising sort of piece to this for me is recognizing that sort of reform movement is in fact in and of itself very splintered with widely divergent views. So I came to the conclusion that it would be really hard to actually create a declaration of education that would encompass everybody's beliefs. But if you created a way at a grassroots level for people to set up their own definitions, their own education declarations that then could guide their own decision making, that you've offered them sort of broad set of principles they could pick and choose from, the ones that they're comfortable with, where nobody has to buy into the whole thing. And this actually goes back to a session I did at COSIN where they tried to draft a document that everybody would agree on, and it became clear to me very quickly that I wasn't sure there was actually value in everybody agreeing on everything, and was sort of looking for an alternate way. So again, any thoughts here would be most appreciated. Ruth, I'm really interested in your comments there in the chat.
Will there be a way for people to participate in that event, Steve, online if they're not available to be in Pennsylvania?
So yeah, I'm not sure we'd be able to do it that particular night, and I'm not actually going to be leading that night one. Bernie Jean Porter is, and I'm not sure that she even agrees with me, and so I'm just going to let her do her thing. She does something called a future search. But the one I'm thinking of, I actually think we could do online. There's a separate event, the same way that we've talked about it, and I'm renting space here in Sacramento in June to hold one here locally, to just advertise locally to friends and families and parents and educators to say, hey, come, I want to try this out and see what it's like, and then use that as a model that you could actually sort of give to people to do in their own local areas with their own results. And so if that ends up being working, then the whole idea or the whole intent is to share it and to have your own local experience. But yeah, I'd love to do a one online, and then I'm going to try and do a physical one as well. Okay, so it sounds like we may have exhausted our time, but really appreciate you all being here. Loved that chat with Mark, and hope you'll tune in another night. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Peggy. Always the positive. Most appreciated. Bye, everybody.